my favorite people, women representing both the PIRS and the University Women's Club. The theme set by the United Nations, as you heard this year, is inspiring change. Both your organizations have a history of inspiring change for women and advocating for the advancement of women. While International Women's Day gives us an opportunity to honor the work of the suffragettes and the world peace activists of past years, it also gives us a chance to honor women all over the world working for change today, reminding us of the inequalities still to be addressed. So it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be among all of you who are activist women yourselves. As an immigrant woman to Canada, I have benefited greatly by the sisterhood offered to me by individual Canadian women and women's organizations in the various communities that I have worked and lived in over the last 54 years. With their support and inspiration, and the knowledge I gained through the various women's networks, I was able to make a contribution, and together with so many of my Canadian sisters, many of you are here, I was able to challenge the status quo of women's equality here in Canada. PIRS is one of those organizations which offered me leadership roles over the years and continues to do so with so many immigrant and refugee women today, but also at the global level. For example, at the global level, the Canadian women's organizations such as the National Council of Women and the Federation of the University Women's Clubs, established over 100 years ago, they were active at the founding of the League of Nations, and later at the founding of the United Nations itself at the end of the Second World War. These women pushed for the establishment of several of the United Nations agencies, such as WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNESCO, and several of the other United Nations agencies to look out for issues of healthcare, education, arms control, and disarmament. Again, the same women had significant impact on the wording of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1 of the Declaration states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, instead of the original draft, which said all men are born equal and free. The women argued, and these were some of the Canadian women who argued that the word men represented gender and non-human species, and therefore excluded women. They succeeded to make the change which was necessary. The history of the International Women's Day is the story of women making history for equal footing with men. They marched for the right to vote, the right to hold public office, right to work, to vocational training, and to end discrimination. I want to go over the story of women's struggle in Canada, particularly for my immigrant sisters. Women in BC did not have the right to vote until 1917, which excluded women of color and First Nations people. People of color got the vote in 1920, 3 years later. But the Aboriginal people, both men and women, had to wait until 1960, to get the right to vote. Women in Canada were not recognized as persons until 1929, which excluded them from holding office. And yet, during the Second World War, women were called upon to take positions which were denied to them while men were available to hold these positions. It was the work of the famous 5 Canadian women, namely Emily, Irene, Nellie, Henrietta, and Louise, which made it possible for the Canadian women to be recognized as persons under the law. In 1921, Agnes MacPhail, became the first woman member of parliament. But it was not until 1957 when Ellen Fairclough became the first woman cabinet minister in Canada. In 1972, Rosemary Brown, an immigrant woman from Jamaica, became the first black woman to get elected in all of Canada, even though a cabinet position was denied to her. I must pay a special tribute to Rosemary, who forced the provincial government to examine and get rid of all policies and regulations which were sexist and racist in our own province. She was able to force the government to fund shelters for abused women and rape relief centers. Every year, we honor the women of BC by the Rosemary Brown Award for Women, which takes place at this club. Rosemary certainly was a friend and a member of the University Women's Club, and a tradition I think I should recognize somewhere here. There is Cleta Brown. She's following her mother's tradition of being an active member and a leader in this club. Thank you. Nice to see you, Cleta. In 1982, the only woman in Canada who held the position of a prime minister was Kim Campbell for 4 months in 1993. Today, as we know, we have several women leading the provincial legislatures, including our own in BC. We must remember these facts and names of these women because they paved the way for those of us who are here today celebrating the International Women's Day. In 1981, Canada signed on to the UN Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982 took thousands of women fighting to get Section 15 and 28 so that equality rights were enshrined in the Constitution of Canada. The establishment of Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, generally known as LEAF, is one of the outcomes of that struggle. A local and a national association was established in the mid-80s, which made a big difference in increasing government resources in English as a second language training, improved rights of women in immigration policies and refugee determination system, in addition to providing a forum for the women themselves to learn from each other and advocate for changes they felt. And I want to acknowledge somewhere in the group, there is Khartoum Siddiqui, who was one of the leaders of that movement in the 80s. Some of you gathered here are already active in the areas of violence against women and girls, such as ending marital rape, honor killings, forced marriages, dowry deaths, and acid throwing. In some regions of the world where we come from, or we may still have relatives and friends, ending violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity is a challenge we have to take on, even when the arguments are covered in rationalizations based on culture and religion, such as the ones that we are seeing in the United States, in Uganda, in Canada. We have about 250 groups across Canada who are working so hard, not only to inform the general public about what's happening to the women and the girls in sub-Saharan Africa, those who are left behind because of deaths of their parents, and the grandmothers who are looking after the 20 and 30 grandchildren. And these women of Canada, they have raised over $19 million over the last 7 years in order to support those grandmothers in Africa. And so it is hard to believe, though, that we have over 800 women of First Nations ancestry missing and murdered in Canada itself. And yet the government is refusing to have an inquiry, which the Canadian Human Rights Commission and thousands of other women's organizations and individuals supported this call for a national inquiry, which has to deal with the systemic are the root causes of violence against women. Poverty, lack of affordable housing, human trafficking, exploitation of women and girls at every level in our society. It's a social change we must fight for at home, in local communities, and around the globe, working together, both men and women, in the struggle for equality and justice. Inspiring change, celebrating victories are the strategies which will take us there. Happy International Women's Day. Thank you.